The day, Mr. Michael Rebman from the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center joins us. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
I had to apologize. Normally we talk to Aaron, and he's on Zoom, and he's off until tomorrow, and so we had a phone call with Mel, and I just finished the conversation, went to the break, forgot to hang up the phone. So anyway, we figured it out. We have Michael on the phone, and where would you like to take us today on our journey into the past?
Well, we're going to continue with agriculture, but something that was interesting, unrelated to that, on the way to work today, I turned on the radio, and the station was doing a This Day in History thing, and they mentioned that the 14th Amendment was ratified today. What's interesting is that...
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. 14th Amendment ratified today, all right?
But what's interesting is what they didn't mention was that the 14th Amendment caused the Bill of Rights to be applied towards state laws in addition to federal law.
Was that a little unusual for this type of amendment or this type of legislation, if you will?
Not really, but what's interesting to consider is that before the 14th Amendment, the Bill of Rights did not, like I said, did not apply to state law, which meant that unless state laws and state constitutions had their own Bill of Rights, the basic concepts of the Bill of Rights did not apply. So states could have their own religion and mandatory church before the 14th Amendment. And if states did not want people to own arms, they could restrict firearm ownership in ways that Bill of Rights did not apply, which is why, especially the southern states, they banned black people from owning firearms at all. And there was no Second Amendment way to stop it because before the 14th Amendment, the Second Amendment only applied to federal laws.
But the 14th Amendment changed that for all amendments?
Yes, and for all amendments going forward as well.
And for those that don't remember, the 14th Amendment addresses aspects of citizenship and the rights of citizens. The most commonly used and frequently litigated phrase in the amendment is equal protection of the laws, which figures prominently in a wide variety of landmark cases, including Brown versus Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, Bush v. Gore, Reed v. Reed, and University of California versus Bake. I think that's how you pronounce that, B-A-K-K-E. So, and a lot of people, for whatever reason, have just forgotten their government classes. I mean, an amendment to the Constitution can be done. The Congress has to pass it, the president has to sign it, and then I forget the number, but a majority of the states have to approve it.
I think it's three-quarters.
Three-quarters of the states
are required for ratification.
For ratification, but that is how you amend the Constitution of the United States. So, and
the most recent one was done in the 90s. I believe that was the last amendments had to do with congressional pay.
Yeah, I wish we had abolished it, but that's not what it was. 27th Amendment to the Constitution, no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until the election of representatives shall have intervened. So they can't give themselves a pay raise. They can vote a pay raise for future Congresses. So that was the 27th Amendment. When was that adopted? Doesn't say on this particular website that I have uncovered, but that is the most recent one. You are correct.
Yeah, I think that, if I remember correctly, it was the 90s, but I'm sure we could sit here and just think for the next 20 minutes of when it was done. Probably should move on.
Yes, let's move on.
Yeah, because there's a lot to talk about with agriculture, with how Eddy County developed and how agriculture developed. So last week I mentioned that there were some laws that determined how people could get federal land, because in the 1860s, 1870s, all of Eddy County was federal land. And so in order to get federal land for your own, for farming purposes, there was the Preemption Act of 1841, which allowed people squatting on federal land, non-surveyed federal land, to buy up to 160 acres that they've already developed for $1.25 an acre, or for $200 total. And then there was the Homesteading Act of 1862, which allowed people to file to homestead on already surveyed federal land for 10 cents an acre down and $1.25 an acre after 18 months of development, for a total of $216 for 160 acres. And then there's the Timber Culture Act of 1873, where if people have already filed on a homestead, they could file on additional land next to it. There's a $10 fee. They have to do improvements on it, but they also have to plant at least 40 acres of trees on the land. And it's already surveyed land, so no squatting. And that takes 10 years to get full title to the land. And then finally, the Desert Land Act, which allowed people to homestead on up to 640 acres. They have to apply for it first, 25 cents an acre down, and then once they do the improvements on the land for 3 years, they can pay $1 an acre to get full ownership of it, so for $800. And that was land that was already surveyed by the government, which was deemed to be desert with no timber or minerals.
Just desert land. If you want some land here, you can buy it.
Yes. Oh, you have to homestead on it first, of course.
Sure.
But residency was not actually required for that one. For the homestead, for timber culture, for preemption, you have to have a house on it. Which is interesting that Desert Land Act did not require that. And in fact, most of Eddy County was desert land.
Right. Well, if you don't throw water on it, not much is going to grow, if anything, in this part of the country. So what seemed to be the primary motivation behind these acts? What's your interpretation of what the Congress was attempting to do with these different acts?
Well, for all of them, their intent was to get people to move out west, to develop the land, to develop cities and towns, and to spread, farms and farming from sea to shining sea. That was the goal. But interestingly enough, that didn't exactly work out for Eddy County. In part because it really was desert land. You can't really farm on it.
Right.
And so what ended up happening was that the first people to really try to settle and build ranches and towns in the area focused on ranching. And so you had people like, of course, John Chisholm. He established ranches. He sort of used homesteading, but what ended up happening was he, of course, got his own homestead, but you're only allowed one homestead per person.
Mm-hmm.
So he gained additional land by having his employees homestead on the land, who in turn, once they got the land, they signed it over to him. And he also just flat out squatted on federal land and on private land.
Yeah.
And he had wealth and influence, so who's going to stop him? Except until the Lincoln County War started, at which point actually was a chance that he could be stopped, because the people who had a habit of stealing his cattle, who he in turn had a habit of using their land for his cattle down at Seven Rivers, they went against him. So that could have been a lot more violent for him.
Right.
But he wasn't the only one. Like there's down in Eddy County, Captain Brandon Kirby, he was actually English, but he had a really large ranch. L. Wallace Holt, and of course, Charles and John Eddy. They had large ranches, and in fact, in 1884, the Eddy Bissell Cattle Company, through homesteading, had 20,000 acres of land.
Wow, it's an awful lot of territory.
Even though individually people are only entitled to 960 acres in total, if they follow the laws.
Was that a lot of money at that time? I mean, it's hard to compare it to, you tell somebody $800 today and they're, it's money, but it's not as big a hurdle as it might have been back then. Was that considered a lot of money for the time?
It was. It wasn't, millionaire levels of money, because there actually were millionaires back then, but when an average laborer might make $75 a month, it's for doing like really hard but skilled labor, like building brick and stone buildings, knowing how to design the buildings. Then that's coming up with 800 could be a bit difficult. On the other hand, of course, if they actually do the improvements on the land and they have they have cattle that they can sell, then they could easily make that $800.
Right. And I'm going to assume a lot of people failed in their efforts. They'd buy this cheap land out west and assume they knew it was desert, figured that they could make something work, and a lot of them, I'm sure, didn't have success.
Well, that's actually an interesting point. There wasn't a lot of failure in the 1880s, 1890s, because there wasn't a lot of there were homesteads, but there weren't as many homesteads as there were claims, and that's where it gets interesting. How Charles Eddy and others like him accumulate so much land because they fraudulently filed claims. And that was actually a national concern and a national scandal in the 1880s out west. How these homesteading laws that were intended to empty out the cities and get farms everywhere were being used to accumulate these massive company-owned farms, like the Eddy Bissell Cattle Company, which they decided to make a significant shift from being just cattle. In 1886, Pat Garrett, Charles Eddy, and then later James Hagerman got together and started pooling resources, started getting investors, and started buying up, developing these fraudulent lands, these fraudulent homesteads, to develop the Pecos Irrigation. First it was the Pecos Valley Land and Ditch Company in 1887, which they then pooled more resources to develop the Pecos Irrigation and Investment Company, which bought out the Land and Ditch Company. And then in 1890, they got more investments, and they formed the Pecos Irrigation and Improvement Company, which bought out the resources of the Pecos. It keeps on going from there and there until you get to the Pecos Company, and then finally the Pecos Valley Company, which eventually had a lot of their sources bought out by the federal government when they bought Avalon Dam. So it's kind of complex.
It does sound complex. For this part of the state, or Eddy County area, was had the Indian population, that I think you said this before, they weren't real prevalent in this part of the country, were they?
They were until the Army forced them to live on the Mescalero Reservation in the 1860s and 1870s.
Okay, which would have been before the land grant times?
Yes, that would have been before the especially the Timber Culture and the Desert Land Acts.
Okay.